Hutchinson, Kansas. Thursday, March 12, 2009. At 7:30 a.m., 15-year-old Ethan Parker locks the front door, pulls on a faded blue backpack, and takes the same shortcut he's used since 7th grade, across Kerry Park, toward Hutchinson High. At 7:45, neighbor Dorothy Miller, 72, watches him pass the park path with headphones on, walking steady. Nothing unusual. By 8:15, roll call hits. Ethan's chair is empty. The attendance system flags a no-show. Calls start. Mom to the school, school to friends. No texts, no posts, no messages. At home, his room is normal. Homework half finished on the desk. No cash missing, no packed clothes. No sign of a plan. Officers trace the route he should have taken. Weather is clear. Foot traffic is routine. A 20-minute walk has turned into a hole in the day. Within hours, the case is entered as an endangered missing juvenile. The first map goes up. Home, park, high school. The short line of sidewalk where a neighbor saw him and where the trail stops. No signs of a struggle. No goodbye. 45 minutes created a 15-year mystery. If you want the full picture, the search grids, the canine trail that dies near a service road, the first tip about a green van. Stay with me for the next section. Like, subscribe, and tell me what detail you'd check first. Your comment might match what investigators found in the hours that followed. Thursday, March 12, 2009. Hutchinson, Kansas. It was a clear morning, the kind that felt routine and unremarkable. 15-year-old Ethan Parker got up early, packed his old blue backpack, slipped on his headphones, and grabbed a slice of toast on his way out the door. He wasn't running late, and he wasn't in a hurry. Just another school morning on the same short walk he'd made for years. Ethan's route was predictable. From his family's home on East Maple Street, across the small footpath that cut through Kerry Park, then onto the main road leading toward Hutchinson High. It was a quiet neighborhood. Families, retirees, kids on bikes. Nothing about that morning suggested it would become the most analyzed walk in local history. At 7:45 a.m., a neighbor, Dorothy Miller, 72, looked out her window and saw him passing the park path. She remembered the blue backpack, the headphones, the way he looked relaxed. Just another teenager on his way to class. She didn't think much of it. 20 minutes later, when the first period bell rang, Ethan's chair was empty. The attendance system flagged him absent. By 8:30, the school secretary called Ethan's mother to verify whether he was sick or running late. She wasn't expecting the call. She said he'd left right on time. At first, it was easy to believe there had been a mix-up. Maybe he'd gone to the library or met a friend before class. But by 9:15, when he still hadn't shown up, that calm morning started to unravel. His mother checked his room. Everything was in place. His phone charger was plugged in, his homework half finished on the desk, his lunch money still in a jar on the dresser. His computer was open, on a science project he'd been working on the night before. There was nothing missing except his backpack. Calls started flying between school staff, neighbors, and Ethan's friends. Nobody had seen him since 7:45. There were no texts, no messages, and no recent activity on his social accounts. Within 2 hours, what had started as a late attendance report turned into a missing person alert. By noon, Hutchinson police had set up an incident post near the Parker home. Sheriff Mark Reynolds, who had handled several local disappearances in the past, took charge of the investigation. He told reporters later that day, "We had no evidence of a runaway, and no reason to think Ethan left on his own." Officers began retracing his route, marking each possible sighting on a grid. Canine units were brought in by early afternoon. The dogs picked up Ethan's scent along the sidewalk leading through Kerry Park, but lost it abruptly near a service road pull-off behind the park's north edge. That detail would later become one of the central focuses of the investigation. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging were dispatched to search the tree line, the fields, and the banks of Kerry Lake. The searches came back empty. There were no heat signatures, no disturbed soil, no signs of a struggle. The ground was dry and undisturbed, like he'd simply walked out of frame. By late afternoon, local news stations had picked up the story. A missing high school sophomore from a quiet Kansas town. Gone without warning. Flyers were printed overnight and distributed across Reno County. Volunteers, neighbors, parents, classmates joined search teams, checking every trail, every drainage ditch, every parking lot within a mile radius. At a brief press conference, Sheriff Reynolds told the community, "We have no evidence of foul play, but we have no indication that this was voluntary either." It wasn't much, but it was the truth. The case didn't fit either side of the usual line. That same evening, the Parker family appeared on local television for the first time. Ethan's mother stood in front of their home and pleaded, "If you see him, please call, even if you think it's nothing." Behind her, porch lights from neighboring houses glowed like quiet watch posts. Tips began to pour in, but most were false leads, sightings of boys who looked similar or calls from people convinced they had heard something suspicious. One man reported a car idling near the park that morning, but the description changed with every retelling. Then came the first potential clue. Around 3 p.m., a search team found a black backpack in the brush near Kerry Park Woods. It contained blank notebook paper and a set of pens. The family confirmed immediately that it wasn't Ethan's. Still, it deepened the uncertainty. Someone else had left something behind, just not him. A second tip came from a parent at Hutchinson High. She'd seen a green van moving slowly past the school's drop-off lane around 8 a.m. She remembered it because the driver seemed to be circling. Police took the report seriously. A composite sketch of the van driver was created and distributed across local counties, but no matches came back from the state database. Investigators reviewed camera footage from nearby gas stations and stores, but Hutchinson in 2009 had limited surveillance coverage. The few cameras available were low resolution and didn't capture the park path or side roads clearly. Not a single image of Ethan appeared. The weather that morning ruled out environmental dangers. Skies were clear, temperatures in the mid-40s. There were no water hazards or storm drains deep enough to conceal anyone. Everything pointed to an external intervention. Someone, or something, had stopped him. By early evening, the Hutchinson Police Department met with representatives from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to determine next steps. The case was officially entered into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, under the classification Endangered Missing Juvenile. Flyers with his photo and physical description, height, weight, clothing, were sent to all surrounding counties. Businesses were asked to review any parking lot footage from that morning. Gas stations checked their customer logs. Truck drivers passing through were interviewed at rest stops. Nothing surfaced. No signs of theft, argument, or fight. No pattern of conflict at home or school. At 6 p.m., Sheriff Reynolds wrote in his preliminary report, "Unlikely voluntary absence. Probable abduction." But without witnesses or evidence of a struggle, It was only a working theory. Through the night, volunteers continued searching the outskirts of town. They followed creek beds, wooded trails, and old service roads. By 9 p.m., the only physical clue was still the canine trail that ended where the pavement met the dirt, a place where a vehicle could easily have stopped. The next morning, police extended the search radius another 5 miles. Drones were still years away from being standard equipment, and most of the work relied on manpower and intuition. The longer they searched, the more impossible it became to explain how a 15-year-old could vanish in daylight on a route less than a mile long. By the end of that first day, investigators had a timeline that stopped cold at 7:45 a.m. Dorothy Miller's sighting remained the last confirmed moment anyone saw Ethan alive or free. The story spread fast across Kansas. News anchors repeated the same headline every hour. High school student disappears on way to class. Police investigating possible abduction. Behind every headline was the same unanswered question. How does a kid disappear on a 20-minute walk? As night fell, the Parker family kept their porch light on, a small beacon that stayed burning for years. Inside the police station, detectives pinned a map of Hutchinson to the wall. Ethan's route was marked in red, the service road circled in black. That short, familiar walk now carried the weight of a mystery no one could explain. In small towns, routine is safety. But for the Parkers, that routine ended at 7:45 a.m., the moment ordinary life turned into a case file. If you were in Hutchinson that week, or if you've ever wondered how fast a missing case can turn cold, stay with us for part 2. The first 48 hours, when the search begins. Like, subscribe, and tell us what you think might have happened between 7:45 and 8:15 that morning. By noon on March 12, 2009, the quiet Kansas town of Hutchinson had turned into a command zone. Patrol cars lined the block where Ethan Parker lived, and yellow tape marked the edges of Kerry Park. Inside a white tent set up near the Parker home, officers, volunteers, and fire crews huddled over maps spread across folding tables. Sheriff Mark Reynolds took command. He'd handled missing person cases before, but this one felt different. Too fast, too clean. He ordered an immediate perimeter lockdown stretching 2 miles around Kerry Park and Kerry Lake. Roads were blocked, patrols dispatched, and volunteers grouped into search teams. Radio traffic filled the air, reports of possible sightings, mostly unconfirmed, but every tip mattered. The family was placed under quiet supervision, their phone lines routed through the command center to manage the flood of calls. As one deputy put it, "From the first hour it was all hands, local law, fire, and anyone with boots and flashlights." By early afternoon, the operation was fully mapped out. Deputies divided the area into 4 colored grid sectors, each responsible for ditches, trails, drainage tunnels, and creek beds. K-9 units arrived from Wichita by 1:30 p.m. The dogs caught Ethan's scent along the Kerry Park cut-through, following it north toward the lake. But less than half a mile in, the scent vanished near a gravel service road beside an old utility shed. Investigators noted the location carefully. A tire track cut across the dirt, shallow but fresh, likely from that morning. It was the first indication that a vehicle might be involved. A helicopter equipped with infrared cameras began sweeping the park's tree line and the lake shoreline. Nothing appeared on the monitor, no body heat, no discarded items, no movement. Teams checked dumpsters, storm drains, and storage yards. The results were the same everywhere. empty ground. By 2 p.m., the first missing child bulletin hit local radio stations. Flyers were already being printed at the sheriff's office, showing Ethan's photo, height, and the short route he walked to school. Within hours, reporters gathered near Kerry Park as volunteers poured in. At 3 p.m., Sheriff Reynolds held the first press conference. Standing under the overcast sky, he told reporters, "We have no sign this was a runaway, and no indication of injury." The crowd of volunteers grew. Firefighters, high school coaches, and local church groups joined the search. The gymnasium at First Baptist Church was converted into a search headquarters, stocked with water, maps, and two-way radios. Each volunteer had to sign in, receive an assignment, and report back hourly. Searchers were instructed not to go alone, not to move any found items, and to log every object or sighting, even footprints or tire marks. The operation ran like a small army. By 5 p.m., the map wall in the gym was covered in colored pins. Then came the first possible clue. Around 3 p.m., a dark backpack was found in the brush near the park woods. Searchers thought it might belong to Ethan, but when the family arrived, they said it wasn't his. The initials stitched inside didn't match. The discovery added confusion, not answers. A few feet away, faint tire impressions in the dirt were photographed, though they were too unclear for casts. A resident later called to report seeing a green van moving slowly past the school's drop-off zone between 7:45 and 8 a.m. The driver, a man in his late 40s wearing a dark baseball cap, didn't match any registered parent or staff. A sketch artist worked with the witness that evening to create a composite. A BOLO alert, be on the lookout, was issued to all surrounding counties within 60 miles. As daylight faded, the air grew cold. Helicopters circled overhead while ground teams combed fields under portable floodlights. Crime scene technicians photographed Ethan's route from home to the park, collecting samples of street dust and soil. A single partial shoe print, roughly Ethan's size, was logged but couldn't be confirmed as his. Police reviewed every nearby camera. The high school's cameras covered only interior hallways and entrance doors. The gas station 2 blocks away had footage, but it was automatically overwritten every 24 hours. By the time investigators arrived, it was gone. To visualize the timeline, analysts created a digital overlay of Ethan's route. Every confirmed sighting, from home to the park, was pinned. The red circle marking where the scent trail ended became the focus of everything. By 6 p.m., the story was everywhere. Local news anchors described a tight-knit town searching for answers. The Parkers appeared on camera for the first time. Ethan's mother stood at the edge of the park and said, "If you know anything at all, please call." Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she held the microphone. The community responded immediately. A hotline received over 100 calls that night. Most turned out to be hopeful guesses or mistaken identities. Still, Sheriff Reynolds listened to every one. "You can't ignore hope," he later said, "even when it keeps you up all night." By 8 p.m., the search radius expanded to 5 miles. State troopers joined in, checking ditches, farm fences, and culverts under blinding floodlights. K-9 teams were redeployed, but every trail led back to the same spot near that service road. The scent stopped there, like a wall. Dive teams were placed on standby to search Kerry Lake the next morning, even though there was no evidence pointing to drowning. At 10 p.m., the helicopter made its final infrared pass. Still nothing. The command notes from that night captured the growing fear in one line. If not here, then where? Detectives started running background checks. Ethan's teachers described him as quiet but reliable. Friends said he wasn't involved in anything risky, no fights, no drugs, no online arguments. His computer history showed nothing alarming. Everything about him seemed ordinary, and that made the disappearance even harder to explain. Friday morning, March 13th, Day 2. Search teams gathered again inside the gym by 7 a.m. Over 100 volunteers signed in. The FBI sent a liaison to assist with mapping and data coordination. The weather remained clear, good for searching, bad for morale. No new evidence, no new leads. By noon, divers combed Kerry Lake, working methodically across the shoreline. Visibility was poor, but they recovered nothing. Helicopters continued grid sweeps, but technology in 2009 was limited. Without drones or widespread street cameras, investigators relied on endurance, not automation. By afternoon, exhaustion showed. A deputy later recalled, "We were searching clean air." Every lead was just another circle back to the same road. That same afternoon, detectives re-interviewed Dorothy Miller, the neighbor who last saw Ethan at 7:45 a.m. Her account never changed. She saw him walking past the park, calm, normal. She didn't see a vehicle but mentioned hearing what might have been an engine start a few minutes later. 2 joggers also confirmed passing through the area shortly before 8 a.m. They didn't see anyone matching Ethan or anyone suspicious. Investigators compared those statements against school arrival times and narrowed the disappearance window to between 7:47 and 8:10 a.m. It was a span so tight that, as one officer said, whoever did this didn't stumble into it. They were waiting. By 5 p.m. Friday, the case was officially elevated under NCIC guidelines as an endangered missing juvenile. Bulletins went out to law enforcement agencies across Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Missouri. Sheriff Reynolds wrote an internal memo that day. If this was voluntary, he'd surface. This isn't voluntary. The helicopter was grounded that evening, and volunteers were dismissed for rest. Inside the command post, the wall map looked like a battlefield. Red pins for confirmed searches, blue for tips, black for dead ends. The highest concentration sat right where the scent ended. 2 days in, the town had turned over every rock, every trail, every inch of open ground. And still, Ethan Parker was nowhere. As night fell again, lights from the command tent flickered across the empty park. The same sidewalks he'd walked every morning were quiet now, taped off and cold becomes. By the end of 48 hours, Hutchinson had searched miles of land and found only silence. The first 48 hours had done their job. They'd ruled out the easy answers. What came next would turn the search for Ethan Parker from a community effort into a criminal investigation. Stay with us for Part 3, Leads, Suspects, and Dead Ends. If you were in Hutchinson that week, or if you think you'd have noticed something others missed, tell us in the comments, subscribe, and join the discussion. Friday night rolled into Saturday morning, March 13th to 14th, and the search changed shape. The broad sweep of parks and ditches narrowed into leads, list cents, and phone logs. The tip line passed 300 calls by dawn. Analysts sorted them into A for urgent, B for routine, C for rumor. Patrol units left the open fields and started knocking on doors at gas stations, the donut shop on Plum, the daycare by the light, the auto lots along Main. Dispatch added a new priority term to every call: green van. Detectives went back over the route again. this time with a different lens. The second pass focused on people most likely to have heard or seen something from behind a window: night shift nurses, home contractors loading before sunup, retirees who keep early hours. Utility crews were asked about service trucks near the park. Postal carriers were asked if anything blocked their path that morning. Teams walked the line of RVs and long-parked trailers by the service road pull-off and knocked one door at a time. Nobody placed Ethan after 7:45 a.m. The path still broke where the canine dogs had stopped. The gravel apron beside the old utility shed. Vehicles became the center of gravity. Investigators fanned out to body shops, tow yards, tire stores, and rental counters within 40 miles. They asked for work orders on older green vans, pulled invoices by paint code and primer orders, and looked for emergency calls about damaged rear doors or scraped bumpers. Fleet depots, plumbing, HVAC, landscaping, were pressed for any off-the-books use before 9 a.m. Nothing flagged. No GPS pings, no repair matches, no unusual cash jobs that morning. Attention moved to people with histories that demanded attention. The first name on the board, Carl Jennings, an interstate trucker with prior assaults. Cell phone pings put him near Hutchinson on March 11th. Detectives met him at a truck stop and took apart his hours. Dash time logs, fuel receipts, and way station stamps put him westbound and out of Kansas by 1 a.m. on the 12th. His cab camera showed the same. Toll records matched the route. The alibi held. His file stayed open in a monitor stack, but he was cleared as a suspect. The next name, Harold Whitman, a former neighbor with a child abduction conviction from years back, now on parole. His GPS ankle monitor and work shift reports placed him 35 miles away during the window. A surprise residence check found a compliant parolee. No green van, no contraband, nothing to hide. His parole officer backed up the timeline. He was cleared as well. With those two eliminated, the county pushed through a full sex offender compliance sweep. Everyone accounted for. No one tied to Ethan by time, place, or phone. State troopers widened the view to the highways, auditing corridor activity from 6:30 to 9:30 a.m. Rest areas and truck stops were asked for plate captures. In 2009, retention was short. Much of what might have helped was already taped over. Cameras became the next fight. The reality then was thin coverage. Very exterior school cameras, no citywide license plate readers, and small business DVRs that looped every 1 or 2 days with clocks set to whatever the owner last punched in. Techs pulled what they could, converted file formats that didn't want to cooperate, and tried to line up timestamps that drifted by minutes or more. One ATM still from downtown showed a dark green van with its plate taped, time-stamped 8:07 a.m. It was too far from Ethan's known path to be a clear link, but the image went into the file. An enhancement request followed, and with it a note from the prosecutor's office about later admissibility. The team tried to hold the public line steady. An endangered missing advisory went out, short of an Amber Alert by the criteria at the time, but strong enough to push Ethan's photo statewide. Local businesses and churches put money into a reward fund. Every broadcast carried the hotline. As the attention grew, so did the noise. A post claiming a Wichita Mall sighting spread and then fell apart under a quick check. Another said a friend saw a fight in the park. No friend ever came forward. Each rumor was addressed within hours, so the searchers weren't steered off the map by stories that couldn't stand up. At school and at home, interviews went deep and stayed factual. Friends, teammates, and teachers described no conflicts, no threats, no secret relationships. Guidance records showed an ordinary week. Phone and text logs ended at 7:29 a.m., with nothing unusual. No spike in direct messages on social media. The school held a parent safety night. The district reinforced a buddy system and asked families to vary routes and watch corners around Kerry Park. On the technical side, investigators mapped cell site coverage and checked Ethan's basic handset for any handshake after he left the house. There was none. The family's landline and the home computer history showed a homework site and nothing else. No chat rooms, no flagged searches, no meeting plans. Forensics tried to get cute with soil. A trace comparison from Ethan's sneakers found in his locker a week earlier matched park soil only in the most general way. It couldn't tell where he stepped that morning. The canine teams ran the trail again and ended in the same place. A vehicle pickup remained the most likely scenario. By midweek, the lead board was crowded and thin at the same time. The whiteboard showed more than 180 leads. 90% were closed as unrelated. 10% sat in a pending column and refused to move. An entire column was labeled green van. Under it, sub-buckets, plate obscured, taped plate, commercial versus private, paint fade. Detectives started seeing a pattern that wasn't helpful. Reports of slow-rolling vans near schools across the county, the kind of calls that flood in after a story breaks. None tied cleanly to the narrow window between 7:45 and 8:15. The pace slowed. Day 10 arrived and door-to-door ended, not for lack of will, but because every door had been tried. Patrols returned to regular beats. The investigative unit kept the case. The family sat for clean, on-record statements to establish a baseline and avoid misquotes later. Victimology stayed the same: a low-risk teenager with a predictable routine, a short walk, and no warning signs. The sheriff summed it up in a line that felt like the first draft of a eulogy for the search. "We chased everything with wheels." The road still ends at the same piece of gravel. Not everything was dead. The ATM still stayed in play, waiting on enhancement. The utility pull-off stayed circled in red on every map. The composite sketch of the van's driver, late 40s in a dark cap, stayed taped to clipboards. But the case itself had shifted. What began as a sprint with boots and flashlights had become a spreadsheet, a set of binders, a stack of DVDs in evidence sleeves, and a tip box labeled Parker, Green Van, that grew heavier in the closet with each passing week. The public briefings moved from hope to procedure. The sheriff now led with the timeline, the lack of camera coverage in 2009, the unchanged fact that Ethan's last confirmed sighting was at 7:45 a.m. by a neighbor who had lived on that block for decades and knew what she saw. He reminded the town that rumors waste gas and that hours matter. He asked business owners to save footage longer, to point their cameras toward sidewalks, to check the timestamps. Some did. Many didn't. That was the era, and it mattered. The last move of the pressure phase wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. The case notes shifted from search to investigate. Patrol callouts were replaced by follow-ups and scheduled interviews. A night helicopter rotation came off the calendar. Volunteers were thanked and stood down. The family released a statement of gratitude and went home to the waiting that comes after the busy part ends. On the map wall, the cluster of red pins around the service road was the only patch of color that made anyone feel anything. 2 sentences closed the week in the log. The first: all actionable leads exhausted. Continue to monitor ATM still enhancement, composite hits, and green van bolos. The second: no evidence places Ethan beyond the utility pull-off. Abduction by vehicle remains the working hypothesis. By the time the engine noise from the last patrol car thinned out along the park, the case no longer looked like a search. It looked like a file that needed a break it didn't have. The lights at the command post came down. The sidewalk where the route began sat empty again, the same as it was before Thursday morning. And with the motion spent and the evidence unchanged, the investigation reached the edge it would not cross for years. With the leads exhausted and pressure rising, the search gave way to the long wait. Next, Part 4. Going Cold. 2 weeks after Ethan Parker vanished, the search stopped looking like a rescue. The tents came down, the volunteers went home, and what had been a living effort turned into paperwork. The Hutchinson Police Department declared the field phase complete and turned everything over to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. It sounded procedural, just a handoff, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. The case had slipped from urgent to ongoing. Every scrap of field data was boxed and labeled: scent logs, tire cast photos, the ATM still of a green van, handwritten notes from every deputy who'd walked the park. The KBI entered it into the state system under a quiet code: endangered missing juvenile, cold case candidate. By early April, Special Agent Laura Bennett took the file in Topeka. She'd seen this pattern before. A case that looked clear on paper but hollow in the middle. Her first step was to rebuild the timeline from zero. She rechecked every timestamp: phone logs, dispatcher calls, school attendance records, even the weather report that morning. The result was clean and lifeless. Ethan Parker, last confirmed 7:45 a.m. Never verified again. Bennett ran re-interviews with everyone from the original list: the neighbor, the joggers, the crossing guard, a delivery driver who thought he'd seen movement by the fence. No inconsistencies, no new angles. She ended her report with one sentence: no deviations. Disappearance sustained between 7:45 and 8:15 a.m. The Parker family stayed in Hutchinson. They kept their home phone active, same number printed on the flyers, in case he ever called. Ethan's room was left as it was, textbooks stacked, desk lamps still plugged in, Wednesday's homework half finished. Every March 12th, the family held a vigil at Kerry Park. It drew smaller crowds each year, but never none. For 5 minutes of local news coverage, the town remembered the boy who vanished on his walk to school. In 2010, the Parkers gave DNA samples to the National CODIS Index, standard for long-term disappearances. They were told it might help, someday, if remains or unknown profiles ever surfaced. It was routine, not hopeful, but it kept the file alive in the system. Analysts turned next to digital traces, hoping technology would catch what the human eye missed. But Ethan's online footprint was thin. Pre-smartphone, prepaid phone, no social media beyond a school email address. His last bank record was the lunch deposit his mother made the day before he disappeared. His phone's plan expired automatically after 30 days. No calls, no logins, no location pings. The green van lead, the center of the first search, had gone silent. No plates matched. No vehicle registered in the area with that make or color during the week of the disappearance. The composite sketch stayed taped to bulletin boards around Kansas for months before it became another sheet in a binder. The investigation settled into its rhythm of turnover. Every couple of years, a new detective took over, bringing energy, reviewing files, calling witnesses again, filing grant requests for forensic reanalysis. Each cycle ended at the same dead end. By 2012, the KBI officially tagged the case as periodic review required. It would never close, but it would never stay active either, just a file, waiting for something to break. Meanwhile, life in Hutchinson kept going. The park reopened. The walking trail was repaved. Students who'd joined the first search teams were now adults with jobs and children. For new residents, the story was something they'd only heard from neighbors, the boy who disappeared near the park. For older ones, it was a quiet scar in the town's history. Parents used his name as a warning when kids walked to school alone. Police officers called it the case that haunted them, not for what they found, but for what they couldn't. After the first year, even officers admitted they didn't know what to chase anymore. Every object they could collect had been analyzed, every interview rechecked. Everything you can touch gets cold, one said, and everything you can't, that's where the answers hide. By 2013, public attention faded. The case appeared in regional news only on anniversaries or during cold case specials. When the Parkers requested coverage, stations agreed, but ratings showed few viewers left. Without public attention, resources followed suit. Active investigations took priority. A retired journalist summed it up later. The hardest part wasn't finding the truth. It was keeping people willing to look for it. Forensics offered no rescue either. KBI labs revisited every sample in evidence. The soil from the service road, too common to isolate. The shoe print, blurred and incomplete. Tire impressions, washed out by March rain. Even the ATM, still enhanced through new software, revealed no clear plate. Every test confirmed the same conclusion. There was nothing left to test. Still, the Bureau preserved it all, sealed, climate-controlled, indexed for indefinite storage. Every piece ready in case future technology could extract something unseen. But evidence ages, and so does attention. The longer the gap grew, the more each file felt like a snapshot from another time. Each December, KBI's cold case panel reviewed open files. Parker's was always on the list: 2009, 2011, 2014. The final notes barely changed. No new evidence. Continue periodic checks. The green van photo remained in the Ballo database. Dorothy Miller's sighting stayed the last confirmed event. The case label on the archive shelf read only, Parker, juvenile male, 2009. By 2015, Hutchinson had changed. New subdivisions, new families, a new park renovation. But the people who'd been there in 2009 still paused when Ethan's name came up. The family still lived in the same house, the same address on old flyers. His mother still left the lamp on in his room, a quiet light seen from the kitchen window. Not as a ritual, but because turning it off made the hallway feel wrong. The investigation had reached what Bennett called a flat line of hope. Nothing new, nothing gone, just waiting. Waiting for a reason to reopen the box with his name on it. Then, one spring morning 7 years later, a DNA lab across state lines generated a routine match alert. A name the system hadn't seen before connected to the Parker family profile. That call, when it came, would change everything. But for now, the story ends here, at the still point of every long disappearance, where time moves forward, but the case does not. It began with a job application, something so ordinary it barely made a sound. In the spring of 2016, in Oklahoma City, a 22-year-old man named Daniel Cooper applied for a warehouse job that required a background check. His documents looked fine at first glance: a Texas birth certificate, a social security card, and a short employment history. But the number didn't match any state-issued record. The employer flagged it to local authorities as a simple paperwork issue, the kind that usually ended with a quick correction. The police ran a database check, routine, procedural. Nothing came back. Following protocol, they requested a DNA sample to confirm identity for employment clearance. Daniel didn't object. He signed the form, swabbed his cheek, and handed it over. There was nothing to hide, he thought. But what he didn't know was that the small cotton swab would wake up a case that had slept for 7 years. Weeks later, a soft alert pinged on a federal terminal in Virginia. The sample, logged as routine, matched a dormant entry in CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. The match was perfect, a 99.99% kinship link to the Parker family of Hutchinson, Kansas. Their son, Ethan, had vanished on his way to school on March 12, 2009. The lab rechecked the chain of custody, repeated the test, and confirmed it again. Then a message went out to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. CODIS hit confirmed. Subject alive. Oklahoma City agent Laura Bennett, who'd led the Parker case years earlier, was called back in. She'd closed her final report in 2014 with the words, "No new evidence." Now, her phone lit up with a message she never expected to see. 7 years of silence ended with one data point, a name that shouldn't exist. By the next morning, a joint operation was underway. The KBI coordinated with Oklahoma City Police to perform a welfare check at the address listed on Daniel Cooper's application, a low-rise apartment on the city's west side. Officers approached quietly, unsure what they were walking into. Daniel opened the door himself, calm, cooperative, confused. He told them he'd lived in Oklahoma his whole life, raised by a woman named Susan Whitaker, whom he called a relative. When asked for identification, he handed over a photocopy of a birth certificate from Texas. The document looked off, the font spacing, the seal, the signature, but it was just convincing enough to pass casual inspection. Officers asked him to come in for a quick interview. He agreed. There were no handcuffs, no resistance. Inside the precinct, Daniel sat across from two detectives and a KBI liaison. He answered every question politely. He said he'd been homeschooled. He didn't remember attending public school. He said he'd always gone by the name Daniel Cooper. Kansas, Hutchinson, Ethan Parker. None of it meant anything to him. Meanwhile, back in Topeka, the KBI lab processed the second DNA swab. Same result. There was no doubt left. The sample belonged to Ethan Parker, missing since age 15. The boy who had walked out of his Kansas home one March morning had grown into a man under a name that didn't exist before 2010. The Bureau didn't move fast. It moved carefully. Before the family could be told, they had to follow recovery protocol. Victim services were briefed. Trauma specialists were assigned. The KBI called the Parkers through their family liaison. The message was simple but cautious. A viable match has been located. Verification is underway. When confirmation came through, the family's world shifted. The call didn't come from a detective or a news report. It came from a counselor reading from a script that had been written for moments exactly like this. Your son has been located. He's alive. The reunion wouldn't happen immediately. It had to be controlled. Medical checks, psychological evaluation, and environment stabilization came first. The Parkers were told to travel to Oklahoma quietly, under KBI coordination, away from cameras and press. It was the same discipline that had defined the investigation. Nothing rushed, nothing public, until the facts were anchored. While preparations were made, investigators began peeling back the layers of the name Daniel Cooper. The trail started in Texas, with a late-filed birth certificate from 2010. The Social Security number attached to it had been created a year later, using supporting documents that didn't match any real hospital or registrar record. Educational paperwork showed only homeschool affidavits, vague, inconsistent, and unverified. Susan Whitaker appeared throughout the trail in shifting roles, sometimes guardian, sometimes aunt, sometimes not mentioned at all. Background checks revealed no biological connection to Ethan Parker or his parents. What had once been a missing person case now looked like a full-scale abduction disguised as a new identity. KBI officials held a closed-door briefing to redefine the file's classification. The Parker case was now recovered missing, suspected child abduction. Federal agents joined the coordination call. The statement written by Bennett that day captured the feeling across agencies. We didn't find a body. We found a life that wasn't supposed to exist. Every artifact from 2009, the witness notes, the green van sketches, the partial ATM image, was pulled from cold storage. The Bureau started rebuilding the case with new eyes. Who was Susan Whitaker? How had she created documents that fooled state systems? And how had she hidden a kidnapped teenager for 7 years without anyone noticing? When the Parkers finally met their son again, it wasn't in a home or a hospital. It was in a neutral facility arranged by Federal Victim Services. Sterile walls, soft lighting, medical staff nearby. Ethan, or Daniel, as he still called himself, entered hesitantly. He didn't cry or run forward. He studied them with quiet uncertainty. When asked if he remembered Kansas, he shook his head. He said he remembered moving when I was little, and nothing before that. Detectives stayed outside the room. For now, this was family business. DNA had already confirmed the truth, and dental records from childhood finished the job. Ethan Parker was alive. Kidnapped at 15, renamed, and raised as someone else. Within a week, Oklahoma City police served preliminary search warrants at properties linked to Susan Whitaker. What they found deepened the mystery. Inside her residence, investigators seized professional-grade printing equipment, blank certificate paper, and digital files labeled with multiple fabricated names. Rent payments were made in cash. There were no bank accounts, no tax filings, and a history of frequent moves, roughly every 2 years. One piece of evidence stood out: vehicle records. Whitaker had once owned a green van registered in Kansas between 2008 and 2010. The make and model matched the description from the original Hutchinson witness reports. The same van seen creeping near school drop-off lanes the morning Ethan disappeared. The registration had been changed in 2011, shortly after Daniel Cooper's first recorded appearance. The finding flipped the narrative. The vehicle everyone had written off as coincidence was now the bridge between two identities. The last known sighting of Ethan Parker, and the first trace of Daniel Cooper. By the time Bennett briefed the team that Friday, the tone in the room had changed completely. What began as a closed case was now unfolding into a federal investigation involving kidnapping, identity fraud, and document forgery. 7 years of silence had been broken. Ethan Parker hadn't vanished into thin air. He'd been rewritten into someone else's life. Less than 250 miles separated the place he disappeared from, the place he was found. The KBI and FBI both opened parallel files. Forensic analysts prepared to reconstruct the digital paper trail that built Daniel Cooper. The focus was clear. Trace how a teenager from Kansas became a ghost with a legal identity strong enough to pass for real. And, for the first time since 2009, every unanswered question, every fragment of the story, pointed to one person: Susan Whitaker. She was the link between the green van, the forged documents, and the boy who'd lived half his life not knowing his own name. The cold case wasn't cold anymore. It was burning again, right where it had first gone dark. Within a week of Ethan Parker's recovery, the investigation into Susan Whitaker shifted from discovery to dissection. What detectives once called a mystery now had form, texture, and evidence that could be held in their hands. The first step was execution, a series of synchronized search warrants across Oklahoma City. At dawn, police and KBI agents entered every address tied to Whitaker: her home, her car, her storage unit. The operation ran by the book, every drawer photographed before it opened, every object logged and sealed. At first, the rooms looked plain: modest furniture, neatly stacked bills, envelopes with no names. But inside a desk cabinet, investigators found something different. Dozens of folders, each labeled with unfamiliar names and birth years. Birth certificate paper, ink calibration sheets, a steel embosser used to press seals. Then came the computer. On it, a folder titled Cooper Files. Inside were layered Photoshop documents showing step by step how Daniel Cooper's identity had been built. Fonts replaced, seals copied, numbers adjusted. It was the first time anyone could see, in real time, the machinery behind a life that wasn't real. Digital forensics confirmed the file's origin. The first draft of Daniel Cooper's birth certificate had been created in February 2010, 10 months after Ethan vanished. The metadata showed multiple revisions over the following weeks. Investigators could see her mistakes: a triple O in Cooper, an address that led to a demolished Dallas clinic, a copied hospital logo pasted crookedly into the header. By March, the file stabilized into its final form: a clean, believable Texas birth certificate. From that single document, everything else followed. The Social Security application came next. It listed the same birth date, the same handwriting, and the same misspellings that appeared in Whitaker's own earlier applications. The supporting paperwork, vaccination forms, school affidavits, all carried identical pen pressure, identical blue ink. The evidence said what words didn't need to. Daniel Cooper hadn't been born. He'd been manufactured. Once investigators understood the process, they built the chain. Whitaker had used an affidavit of parental knowledge to file a late birth record in Texas, listing herself as the mother. She attached a notarization stamp from a notary who had died in 2007. That record went unchallenged. The Social Security office accepted it as genuine. From that moment forward, Daniel Cooper existed legally. The same precision extended into his education. Whitaker filed annual homeschool affidavits that required no testing or attendance proof. Each form listed a generic curriculum: reading, math, social studies, and no witnesses. The paperwork met the letter of the law, but not its spirit. There was no teacher, no school district, no oversight. Investigators began connecting this paper world to her movements. They found a registration record for a 1998 Dodge Caravan, green, two-tone paint, purchased in 2008. Maintenance logs placed it in Hutchinson, Kansas. During the same months, Ethan disappeared. In 2011, the vehicle was re-registered in Oklahoma with a new plate and a new odometer reading. The mileage was thousands of miles lower than before. The listed address was a P.O. box. The link was undeniable. The green van that vanished from Hutchinson was the same one Daniel Cooper later rode to his first medical checkup. Agents revisited witness interviews from 2009. One neighbor near Kerry Park remembered a green van idling before sunrise that week. Couldn't recall the driver, only that a woman with short hair had stepped out. When shown an aged photo of Whitaker, she hesitated, then said, "That looks about right." Another witness described seeing a woman with a teenage boy in an Oklahoma hardware store that same summer. Investigators subpoenaed receipts from that chain. One dated July 2009 matched cash purchases withdrawn from an ATM near Whitaker's residence. The timeline closed in. Forensic document examiners turned their attention to the materials seized from her home. The blank certificate paper matched authentic hospital stock sold as surplus years earlier. The watermark was faint, off by a millimeter from genuine state issue. The ink layers revealed consumer toner, not government-grade press. Print pattern analysis showed that the same HP printer created the Daniel Cooper certificate, a school affidavit, and another template labeled Rachel Whitaker. The name had never been used. Investigators speculated it was intended for another future alias. Every file carried the same login credentials. There was no second accomplice, no partner. Susan Whitaker had done everything herself. When investigators tried to follow the money, they hit another wall. Cash only. Whitaker never kept a bank account. She paid rent in person using envelopes handed to landlords. Utilities were set up in fake names, all under the table. Landlords described her as quiet, polite, almost overly cautious. She moved roughly every 2 years, often without leaving a forwarding address. Medical records for Daniel Cooper showed doctor visits and vaccinations billed to insurance numbers that didn't exist. Clinics had accepted photocopies of ID cards that at the time looked real enough. Each detail reinforced a pattern. The abduction wasn't spontaneous. It was maintained, sustained, perfected. Digital analysts spent weeks rebuilding her timeline from the seized hard drives. File metadata, printer logs, and email timestamps created a map of her movements. One encrypted folder labeled Archive 2009 revealed everything. Inside were early drafts of the forged birth record and a folder titled Photos, Hutch. Inside that folder, investigators found a newspaper clipping from March 2009 about Ethan Parker's disappearance, underlined in red. Next to it was a photo of a green van parked near a chain-link fence, the image taken from a second-story window. The photo's metadata placed it at a motel less than 3 miles from Kerry Park, taken the day after Ethan vanished. That single image confirmed what no one had been able to prove. She had stayed in Hutchinson long enough to watch the search unfold. As evidence mounted, the legal framing began to shift. Federal prosecutors prepared to file charges: kidnapping across state lines, identity fraud, obstruction of justice, and document forgery. Each charge had a corresponding file. The challenge was connecting the act of forgery to the act of abduction. KBI analysts closed that gap using a pattern of data points: cell tower pings, toll booth logs, and rental receipts. Whitaker's phone registered near Hutchinson on March 12, 2009, then again near Oklahoma City 2 days later. A gas receipt from that same date matched her vehicle's plate and mileage record. The reconstructed timeline told a simple, devastating story. Ethan Parker disappeared on a Thursday morning. By Saturday night, Susan Whitaker was in Oklahoma with him. By February of the following year, he was someone else. The final case report, 127 pages long, was completed by late summer 2016. It laid out every piece of evidence, every forgery, every movement in order. The conclusion read plainly: identity construction confirmed. Custodial concealment sustained 7 years. Subject used falsified state and federal documents to maintain false identity for minor Ethan Parker's life, had been erased and redrawn. And now, every page of proof sat on a federal desk, waiting for the next step: indictment. The investigation had come full circle, from a gravel road in Kansas to a file room in Oklahoma. The missing boy was home, but the woman who'd taken him was still free. And that's where the story turns, because finding Ethan was only the beginning. The real battle was proving what Susan Whitaker had done, and why. If you've followed this story so far, stay for the next chapter. Part 7. Building the Federal Case. Because this is where investigation becomes prosecution, and every forged paper, every vanished mile, starts to speak. Like, comment, and share if you believe truth always finds its way back, no matter how many years it takes. When the Kansas Bureau of Investigation finished its 127-page reconstruction, the case no longer lived in field reports or witness sketches. It was ready for court. Within days, federal coordination began. A joint task force was formed: KBI, FBI, Oklahoma City Police, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas. Their goal was straightforward but massive: take 7 years of evidence spread across 2 states and turn it into a single, airtight federal case. Every agency brought something different to the table. The KBI had the physical chain of custody. The FBI had the digital proof. Oklahoma police held the property seizures. And the federal team had to decide how to make all of it tell one story. One that ended with intent, not coincidence. Meeting notes later described those early briefings as cautious but methodical. They already knew what happened. Now, they had to prove why, and prove it in the language of federal law. Investigators started by rebuilding the entire timeline on a wall that stretched across an operations room. On the left, a simple heading: March 12, 2009, disappearance. On the far right, August 2016, recovery. Every column between them was filled with evidence tabs, dates, and arrows. The first segment marked 7:30 to 8:15 a.m., the 45 minutes when Ethan Parker vanished. The next covered 2009 to 2010, when the name Daniel Cooper first appeared in Texas records. The final stretch showed the years between, where Whitaker maintained the deception through forged documents, school filings, and medical visits. They pulled highway toll logs, vehicle registrations, and phone tower pings to retrace her route from Hutchinson, Kansas to Oklahoma City. On a large satellite printout, the line connecting the 2 cities was drawn in red. 249 miles separating a missing child and a false identity. The visualization didn't just show distance. It showed planning. The prosecution could now prove that this wasn't an impulsive act. It was built to last. The digital evidence became the backbone. FBI technicians extracted every trace from Whitaker's hard drives: file timestamps, printer serial numbers, and document metadata. Each forged file, from the Texas birth certificate to the homeschool affidavit, was linked to her personal devices. What stood out wasn't just creation, it was maintenance. Every few years, Whitaker reopened files, made small edits, and reprinted forms with new seals or updated fonts. It was the digital footprint of a living lie, renewed again and again. One analyst wrote in her report, "This wasn't a one-time forgery. It was ongoing identity management." That line became one of the most quoted phrases in the case. The paper trail followed naturally. KBI specialists compared every printed form seized from Whitaker's home to her devices. Under magnification, the misalignment in the state seals was identical across documents. Even the pixel grid under each signature matched. The same HP printer had produced every piece of Daniel Cooper's life, from the forged birth record to the fraudulent Social Security paperwork. For prosecutors, that continuity mattered. It proved that this wasn't a collection of separate crimes. It was one sustained concealment. Under federal statute, that distinction meant the difference between fraud and kidnapping across state lines. Next came the witnesses. Investigators assembled what they called the ladder. At the top were technical experts, DNA analysts, document examiners, digital forensics specialists. Below them were the everyday voices that bridged the two halves of the story. A Kansas neighbor who saw the green van idling by Kerry Park, an Oklahoma landlord who rented to Whitaker under a false name, and a clinic nurse who'd once treated Daniel Cooper for a mild infection, using paperwork that later tested fake. Each testimony connected one link of the chain. The Kansas witnesses anchored the abduction. The Oklahoma witnesses proved continued control. Together they showed that Whitaker never released Ethan, not physically, not legally, not on paper. The federal side was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Mendez. Her approach was deliberate and restrained. She instructed her team to narrow the scope instead of drowning the jury in details. "We don't need to prove every forged page," she wrote in her notes. "We need to prove one life lived under false law." That phrase guided every decision. The indictment would focus on two main counts: kidnapping a minor across state lines and sustained identity fraud. Everything else, obstruction, forgery, document tampering, would support those pillars. The idea was to build a case that felt simple in structure but impossible to refute. Meanwhile, Whitaker's appointed counsel began signaling the likely defense strategy. She would claim she'd been caring for Ethan under an informal guardianship, perhaps believing she was rescuing him from an unsafe home. Mental instability might be raised as mitigation, but the task force already had counter-evidence: falsified ID renewals, alias utility bills, and cash-only payment histories. Each action showed intention, not confusion. When Mendez summarized her position to the team, she put it plainly: "You can't claim protection when every move you made was designed to erase a family." By late 2023, after 8 months of review and expert depositions, the U.S. Attorney's Office convened a grand jury in Wichita. 30 exhibits were presented: DNA matches, printer analysis reports, ATM footage from 2009, and the original forged birth certificate from 2010. The jurors deliberated for less than 2 hours. Their decision was unanimous. A sealed arrest warrant was issued immediately. The following morning, federal agents and Oklahoma City police surrounded Whitaker's residence at dawn. She was arrested without resistance. Officers cataloged every remaining file, drive, and document for chain of custody preservation. The moment marked the transition from investigation to prosecution. For 7 years, her name had been a line in a cold file. Now it was on the front page of an indictment. After arraignment, the case entered the pre-trial phase. Defense attorneys moved quickly to challenge key evidence. They argued that the ATM footage was too grainy to be reliable, and that the printer pattern analysis was technical speculation. Both motions were denied after forensic experts demonstrated their validity in preliminary hearings. The prosecution submitted every chain of custody record, signed, dated, and verified. Not a single item showed a break. The court set a trial date: June 2024, U.S. District Court, Wichita, Kansas. By then, the federal file would include over 600 exhibits and 43 witnesses, each one cross-referenced and logged. By early 2024, the case of United States v. Susan Whitaker was ready for trial. Ethan's identity had been restored, his life reclaimed, but justice was still waiting to be decided. Inside the U.S. Attorney's office, the final briefing ended with a single line written on the whiteboard. We proved how she built a lie. Now we prove she lived it. Boxes of evidence lined the hallway, labeled, sealed, and ready for the courtroom. The team that once searched fields and woods now carried binders of evidence instead of flashlights. For 7 years, the question haunting Hutchinson had been, where is Ethan Parker? Now the question had changed. Why did Susan Whittaker take him, and what will the law do about it? That answer would soon come from a jury. By June 2024, the Wichita Federal Courthouse became the final stage of a story that had started 15 years earlier. United States versus Susan Whittaker. The hallways were lined with quiet anticipation. No media frenzy, no theatrics. Just the steady hum of a system finally reaching its conclusion. Inside the courtroom, 7 binders labeled Exhibits A through G sat neatly on the prosecution's table. Across the aisle, Susan Whittaker, now in her late 50s, sat in a gray suit, her posture composed, her face unreadable. The case wasn't about mystery anymore. It was about proof. What she did, how she did it, and how long she managed to keep the truth buried. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Mendez began the trial with one line that silenced the room. This case is about a boy who was never lost, only hidden, in plain sight by someone who decided the law didn't apply to her. The prosecution opened by returning to the beginning, the 45 minutes on the morning of March 12, 2009. Witnesses from Hutchinson were called first. Neighbor Dorothy Miller, who saw Ethan walking past Kerry Park. The school registrar who flagged him absent at 8:15. And 2 patrol officers who took the first missing person call. Their testimonies were straightforward, factual. A 15-year-old boy left home for school and never arrived. From there, the story shifted to what came next, the creation of a false identity. Jurors were shown a timeline projected on the courtroom screen, each entry marking how quickly a local disappearance evolved into a 7-year fabrication. A single gap in a school roll call had turned into a new life under a new name. Daniel Cooper. Then came the science, the backbone of the case. The government's first expert, a KBI DNA analyst, walked the jury through the moment everything changed in 2016. A routine employment background check in Oklahoma City had triggered a hit in CODIS. The DNA swab submitted by Daniel Cooper matched the Parker family profile at 99.99%. The defense tried to raise questions: contamination, mishandling, coincidence. But the analyst dismantled each point. "Every link in the chain is verified," she said. "No contamination, no transfer, no error." Next was the document examiner. She displayed enlarged images of the forged Texas birth certificate, homeschool affidavits, and insurance cards, all printed from the same machine. Under magnification, the jury saw identical misalignments in the state seals and pixel. He remembered waking up in a strange house. Within days, he was told his new name was Daniel. "I thought she was my aunt," he said. "She never said otherwise." "I didn't know I was missing." There were no theatrics, no tears. His calm delivery carried more weight than any emotional plea could have. The jurors didn't need to see grief. They saw clarity. Whittaker's attorneys built their defense around compassion and confusion. They argued she believed she was protecting Ethan from harm, painting her as a troubled woman acting on distorted instincts rather than malice. They called 2 character witnesses, former neighbors who described her as quiet and kind, someone who looked after people. The defense leaned heavily on her medical records, therapy notes, prescriptions for anxiety medication, a history of isolation. Their narrative framed her as a woman who couldn't separate delusion from love. But the documents told a different story, one of control, precision, and repeated deception. When Mendez began her cross-examination, she didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "If this was about protection, why forge a birth certificate? Why change his name? Why move across state lines?" Whitaker said she wanted to keep things simple. "Simple for whom?" Mendez asked. Whitaker had no answer. Under continued questioning, Whitaker admitted she had changed her license plates for privacy and created fake records to avoid questions. She said, "Within weeks, a 400-page KBI report was completed. Its title read, Case Study, Parker, 2009 to 2024, Interagency Practices and Gaps." The document laid everything bare, what worked, what failed, and what needed to change. The success column credited CODIS DNA matching, precise chain of custody work, and trauma-informed interview methods. The failure column noted what couldn't be ignored. Outdated camera coverage in 2009, weak DVR retention policies, and the total absence of license plate readers on school routes. The report's recommendation list had 14 items. 3 were labeled immediate adoption. All Kansas law enforcement academies were required to add the Parker case to their training curriculum. The file wasn't just a case anymore. It was a playbook. By the end of that year, new modules appeared in police training. Recruits now ran a simulation of Ethan's last 30 minutes, the 7:45 to 8:15 window, making real-time decisions on what they'd do differently. Dog handling teams were retrained to recheck scent trails under different weather and temperature conditions. Officers were reminded to collect private DVR footage within 24 hours before automatic deletion. Printer toner IDs were added to standard evidence checklists, and a digital alert system now ensured DNA samples hit the lab within 48 hours, not weeks. Policy changes, persistence, and science solved what time tried to erase. Justice didn't erase the years, but it prevented the next loss. And for a family that once lived in silence, the legacy became something larger. A system that learned, a town that prepared, and a name that finally came home. If you followed this story to the end, like, comment, and subscribe to share your thoughts. Every interaction helps bring more attention to unsolved cases like this one. Because stories like Ethan Parker's don't just deserve to be heard. They deserve to be remembered.